A millionaire invites a street boy to a lavish party. But then, compassion and kindness changed everything. The scorching summer night shattered with Max's ragged breaths as he sprinted through the dark alley, his worn sneakers pounding against broken concrete. 3 shadows pursued him, their footsteps echoing like death knells in the urban canyon. His trembling hand clutched a crumpled envelope, an invitation that would later prove both his salvation and his curse. "Get the street rat," a voice growled behind him. Heart pounding, Max ducked behind a dumpster, pressing himself against the cold metal. The envelope's gold lettering caught the dim streetlight. "Mr. Davenport cordially invites." Max had no idea this piece of paper would transform his life into a tale of cruel twists, lost family, and ultimate redemption. But first, he had to survive this night. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Max emerged from his makeshift shelter, a forgotten loading dock behind an abandoned warehouse. At 15, his face carried the weathered look of someone far older, dark circles under his eyes telling stories of countless sleepless nights. His clothes, though carefully maintained, bore the unmistakable signs of extended wear. Stretching his stiff muscles, Max mentally prepared for another day of survival. He'd learned the rhythm of the city over the past 7 years, which restaurants threw out edible food, which shop owners might spare some change for small tasks, and most importantly, which areas to avoid. The streets had been his harsh teacher, and he'd proven to be a quick study. "Stay invisible, stay alive," he muttered to himself, a mantra learned through bitter experience. His morning routine was methodical, checking his few possessions: a worn backpack containing a spare shirt, a plastic water bottle, and his most precious possession, a creased photograph of a smiling woman he barely remembered but knew was his mother. As he made his way through the awakening city, memories of that fateful day at Sterling Mall flooded back, as they often did in quiet moments. He was 8 then, holding his mother's hand as they navigated the crowded shopping center. The Christmas decorations had been spectacular, and he remembered being mesmerized by the giant tree in the central court. "Max, stay close," his mother had said, but then came the commotion, a theft, people running, screaming. In the chaos, their hands separated. He remembered spinning around, calling out, "Mom, Mom," but the sea of legs and bodies kept pushing, carrying him further away. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and eventually into years. The social workers had tried, of course. There had been 5 potential adoptions, each ending in heartbreak. The first family, the Petersons, had seemed perfect until they discovered Max's nightmares and tendency to hoard food under his pillow. "We're not equipped to handle his trauma," they'd told the social worker, as if he wasn't sitting right there. The Hendersons lasted 3 months. They'd been patient with his issues, but backed out when their background check into his history came up with too many blanks. What if his real parents come looking? What if there are hereditary health issues we don't know about? Their concerns had seemed rational, but to Max it was just another rejection. The Bradleys, the Connors, and the Watsons all followed similar patterns: initial enthusiasm giving way to hesitation and eventually withdrawal. After the 5th attempt, Max had simply walked away from the system. The streets were harsh, but at least they were honest in their cruelty. He developed his own code for survival. Rule 1: never steal, unless absolutely necessary. It attracted too much attention. Rule 2: stay clean, and relatively well-groomed people were more likely to help someone who showed they were trying. Rule 3: keep moving. Staying too long in one place made you vulnerable. His daily routine had become almost artistic in its efficiency. Early mornings were for checking the bakery dumpsters before the day's fresh bread arrived. Mid-morning meant haunting the edges of the business district, offering to help professionals with their bags or packages for spare change. Afternoons were for the public library, where he could stay warm and continue his self-education through borrowed books and free internet access. Knowledge is the way out, he would remind himself, spending hours reading everything from classic literature to business magazines. The librarians pretended not to notice him coming in day after day, some even occasionally leaving granola bars or fruit on his usual table. But nights were the hardest. In the quiet darkness, memories would creep in: the sound of his mother's laugh, the smell of her perfume, the way she would sing him to sleep. He'd lie awake wondering if she was still searching for him, if she had moved on, or worse, if something had happened to her in the chaos of that day. The failed adoptions had left their marks too. Each rejection had built another wall around his heart, teaching him that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet something in him refused to completely harden. He still helped elderly Mrs. Chen with her groceries every Tuesday, expecting nothing in return. He shared his food with younger street kids when he could, remembering his own early days of hunger and fear. "You're too soft, Jimmy," an older street kid often told him. The streets eat soft people alive, but Max had learned that maintaining his humanity was as crucial to survival as finding food and shelter. He'd seen too many others lose themselves to desperation and bitterness. Today, like every day, he moved through the city like a shadow, gathering what he needed while attracting minimal attention. He'd become expert at reading people: which ones might spare some change, which ones to avoid, which ones might call the authorities. It was a delicate dance of survival, one he'd mastered through years of necessity. As the sun climbed higher, Max made his way to his usual spot near the financial district. Men and women in expensive suits rushed past, their lives so different from his, they might as well have been from another planet. Sometimes he caught fragments of their conversations: million-dollar deals, vacation homes, private schools for their children. It was like listening to a foreign language, one he knew he'd never speak. Yet he refused to give up on education. Between helping busy executives with their packages and running small errands, he would practice math problems in his head, recite poetry he'd memorized, and observe the intricate dance of business and commerce around him. Someday, he thought, though he never completed the sentence, even in his mind. The weight of the past 7 years pressed on him daily: the missed birthdays, holidays, normal teenage experiences. But it was the small things that hurt the most: never having anyone to show his achievements to, no one to comfort him when he was sick, no place to truly call home. As evening approached, Max headed back to his hideout, carefully avoiding the territories of more aggressive street dwellers. He'd learned early on that survival wasn't just about finding food and shelter, it was about knowing the complex social hierarchy of the streets and staying beneath notice of those who might do him harm. In his shelter, he pulled out the worn photograph of his mother. "Another day done, Mum," he whispered, a ritual he'd maintained all these years. "I'm still here, still looking for you." The photo never answered, but sometimes he imagined he could see her smile change, just slightly, telling him to keep going, to stay strong, to never lose hope. But hope was a dangerous thing on the streets. Hope could make you careless, make you take risks, make you trust the wrong people. Yet somehow, despite everything, a small flame of it continued to burn in Max's heart, refusing to be extinguished by the cold reality of his life. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Max helped unload boxes at the back of Tony's restaurant. The owner, a gruff man with kind eyes, occasionally allowed him to work for leftover food. "You're different from the others," Tony would say, studying Max with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Got something in your eyes? Hope, maybe? Or stupidity?" The street community had its own complex social structure. There was Sarah, the elderly woman who fed stray cats and shared her blankets during winter. Marcus, the former teacher who lost everything to gambling but still taught math to street kids under the bridge. Little Jenny, barely 12, who Max protected like a sister. They formed an unlikely family, bound by shared hardship and unspoken understanding. "You're too nice," Max Marcus often warned, watching him share his meager earnings. "Streets don't reward nice," but Max remembered his mother's words: "Kindness is never wasted, sweetheart. It comes back in ways you least expect." These memories of her were like precious jewels he guarded fiercely. The community gathered most evenings near the abandoned railway station. Carlos, a teenage runaway, played his battered guitar while others shared whatever food they'd managed to find. They exchanged information about safe sleeping spots, dangerous areas, and which shelters had beds available. It was a support system born of necessity, but it helped maintain their humanity in a world that often denied it. Max's memories of his mother came in vivid flashes. Her perfume, lavender and vanilla. The way she'd curl her hair around her finger when reading. Her voice singing somewhere over the rainbow on stormy nights. The proud smile when he brought home good grades. These memories sustained him through the coldest nights and hungriest days. "Tell us about your mom again," Jenny would ask during their makeshift dinner gatherings. Max would describe the shopping mall's Christmas decorations, his mother's red coat, her warm hand holding his. He'd stop before the moment of separation that pain was his alone to bear. The street community understood loss. They recognized the look in each other's eyes, the weight of absent families, abandoned dreams. Some, like old Pete, had chosen this life. Others, like Max, had it thrust upon them. But they all shared an unspoken code: help when you can, respect others' space, and never ask too many questions about the past. During winter months, they'd huddle together in abandoned buildings, sharing body heat and stories. Summer brought different challenges: dehydration, sunburn, increased police patrols. Through it all, Max maintained his mother's teachings: stay clean, be polite, help others. "You never know who's watching," she used to say. "Always be the person you'd want others to be." He kept a small notebook, salvaged from a school dumpster, where he wrote letters to her. "Dear Mom, today I helped Mrs. Chen with her groceries again. She reminds me of you, same gentle hands, same kind smile. I'm still looking for you. I hope you're still looking for me too." The street kids called him Professor for his habit of reading newspapers and teaching younger ones basic math and reading. "Knowledge is power," he'd tell them, echoing his mother's words. Some listened, others laughed, but Max knew education might be his only ticket out of this life. His mother had been a nurse, this he remembered clearly. She'd taught him basic first aid, which proved invaluable on the streets. "Always clean the wound first," her voice would echo in his mind as he bandaged Jenny's scraped knee or Carlos's cut hand. The hardest days were holidays. Christmas especially brought back the sharpest memories: the mall, the decorations, the chaos of separation. On these days, the street community rallied around each other, sharing whatever they had, creating their own traditions. They became each other's family, filling the void left by absent loved ones. Max kept his mother's photo in a waterproof bag, along with her silver necklace, the only possessions he had from his previous life. Sometimes he'd trace her face with his finger, trying to remember the exact sound of her laugh, the precise shade of her eyes. Time was slowly eroding these details, and this terrified him more than any physical danger. The street community watched over its own. When Max fell sick last winter, Sarah shared her cold medicine, Marcus kept watch while he slept, and even gruff Tony slipped him extra soup. They understood that survival wasn't just about food and shelter, it was about maintaining connections, preserving humanity in a world that often seemed devoid of it. Every morning, Max would look in store windows, checking his reflection. "Stay presentable," his mother's voice would remind him. "Respect yourself first." He'd straighten his donated clothes, smooth his hair, practice his smile. These small acts of dignity were his way of honoring her memory, of proving that circumstances hadn't broken his spirit. In quiet moments, he'd imagine their reunion. Would she recognize him? Would she be proud of how he'd survived? Had she searched for him all these years? The questions haunted him, but he clung to hope, the last gift his mother had given him, wrapped in memories of lavender perfume and Christmas lights. The gleaming black Mercedes slowed to a crawl as it passed Max, who was helping an elderly woman with her shopping bags. Through the tinted windows, Mr. Davenport observed the boy with calculated interest. Despite his ragged clothes, there was something different about this one, a certain dignity in his bearing, a spark of intelligence in his eyes. "Stop the car," James Mr. Davenport commanded his driver. He watched as Max refused the woman's attempt to give him money, instead smiling and waving goodbye. Interesting, Davenport thought. A street urchin with principles. The window hummed as it descended, releasing a burst of air-conditioned luxury into the summer heat. "Boy," Davenport called, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Come here a moment." Max hesitated, years of street wisdom screaming caution. But something in the man's authoritative tone made him approach, though he maintained a careful distance from the car. "Sir," Max asked, studying the man's expensive suit, his manicured hands, the heavy gold ring on his finger. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power. "I've been watching you," Davenport said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "You're different from the other street children. More refined. Tell me, what's your name?" "Max, sir." He shifted uncomfortably under Davenport's scrutiny. "Max. How would you like to earn some real money?" Davenport reached into his jacket, pulling out a cream-colored envelope. "I'm hosting a charity gala this weekend. We need some extra help with service." Max's heart raced at the mention of money, but experience had taught him to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. What kind of help? Nothing complicated. Serving drinks, helping guests. Basic tasks. Davenport's smile widened. "You'll be paid well, fed well, and given proper clothes for the evening. What do you say?" The envelope felt heavy in Max's hands as Davenport passed it to him. The paper was thick, expensive, with gold lettering that caught the sunlight. Inside was an invitation and details about the event. "Think about it," Davenport said, noting Max's hesitation. "This could be your chance to experience how the other half lives. Maybe make some connections that could change your life." The window began to rise. "The address is in the envelope. Saturday night. Don't be late." As the Mercedes glided away, Max stood rooted to the spot, the envelope burning in his hands like a hot coal. His mind raced with possibilities and warnings. The street had taught him that nothing came without a price, especially from the wealthy. Back in his hideout, Max read the invitation repeatedly under the failing light. The promised payment would be enough to feed him for months. But something about Davenport's smile, the way his eyes had evaluated Max like a commodity, set off alarm bells. But that night he couldn't sleep. The invitation seemed to glow in the darkness, a beacon of opportunity or perhaps a siren's call to disaster. He thought about his mother, what she would advise. "Trust your instincts," she used to say. But his instincts were torn between desperate need and ingrained caution. The next day he sought out Marcus for advice, finding the former teacher in his usual spot under the bridge. "Show me the invitation," Marcus said, adjusting his cracked glasses. He examined the paper carefully, frowning. "Looks legitimate." Davenport's a known name in the city, but Max? But what? Rich people don't just hand opportunities to street kids without a reason. What's his angle? Max had been wondering the same thing. He said it's a charity gala. Maybe he wants to show off his philanthropic side. Marcus snorted. By having a street kid serve drinks? Sounds more like entertainment for his guests than charity. The weight of the decision pressed on Max as Saturday approached. He observed the Davenport mansion from a distance, watching cars come and go, deliveries being made. The house was enormous, like something from a fairy tale, but it felt more threatening than inviting. Some of the street community tried to discourage him. "It's a trap," Sarah warned, her weathered face creased with concern. "Those people don't see us as human beings. We're either charity cases or nuisances to them." But others saw it as an opportunity. "You could scout the place," Carlos suggested. "Maybe find a way in for later." Max quickly shut down that line of thinking. He wasn't a thief, no matter how desperate things got. The internal debate raged on. Part of him saw this as a chance to glimpse another world, to maybe find a foothold that could lead to something better. Another part remembered every harsh lesson the streets had taught him about trusting strangers, especially wealthy ones. He spent hours watching the mansion, studying the people who entered and left. The staff looked well treated, but there was something in their demeanor, a tension, a wariness when Davenport was around that made him uneasy. In the end, it was hunger that decided him. Not just his physical hunger, but a deeper yearning for something beyond mere survival. He was tired of scrounging, tired of wearing donated clothes, tired of being invisible to the world. The day before the gala, he made his decision. "I'm going," he told Jenny, who had become like a sister to him. "But I've got a backup plan." He showed her a crude map he'd drawn of the area around the mansion, marking possible escape routes. "If I'm not back by sunrise Sunday, tell Marcus." Jenny hugged him tightly. "Be careful, Max. Those people, they're not like us. They play different games." As Saturday evening approached, Max prepared himself as best he could. He washed in the gym where a sympathetic janitor sometimes let him use the shower. He borrowed a decent shirt from Carlos and carefully mended his least worn pair of jeans. Standing before a store window, using it as a mirror, Max barely recognized himself. He'd combed his hair neatly, scrubbed his face until it shone, practiced what he hoped was an appropriate serving smile. But his eyes betrayed him. They were still the eyes of a street kid, wary and watchful. The walk to the mansion felt like walking to his own execution. Every step brought a new doubt, a new warning bell in his mind. Yet something pushed him forward: curiosity, desperation, or perhaps the foolish hope that this might be the chance he'd been waiting for. As he approached the service entrance, clutching the invitation like a shield, Max thought of his mother. Would she be proud of his courage or frightened for his safety? The memory of her voice whispered in his mind, "Sometimes the biggest risks bring the biggest reward, sweetheart, but always trust your gut." Right now his gut was churning with anxiety, but it was too late to turn back. A uniformed guard checked his invitation, eyeing him suspiciously before reluctantly waving him through. The service entrance swallowed him like the mouth of a beast, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap of his own choosing. The gleaming halls and polished floors of the mansion's service area were like nothing he'd ever seen. Everything sparkled with wealth and power. As he was led to a changing room where other servers were preparing, Max caught his reflection in a mirror. Despite his best efforts to clean up, he stood out like a sparrow among peacocks. "Remember," he whispered to himself, "this is just one night. Whatever happens, I can survive it. I've survived worse." But as he changed into the provided uniform, Max couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change his life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The transformation from street kid to server was jarring. The uniform they provided was crisp and expensive, the fabric finer than anything Max had ever worn. A stern-faced supervisor named Richards instructed him on proper serving etiquette, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Back straight, eyes down, smile pleasant but not familiar," Richards droned. "And for heaven's sake, try not to touch the guests more than absolutely necessary." The implication was clear: Max's presence was a necessary evil, nothing more. The servants' preparation area buzzed with activity. Other servers, all professionals, gave Max a wide berth, whispering among themselves. He caught fragments of their conversations. Davenport's latest project: street trash. Won't last an hour. The kitchen was a world unto itself, gleaming stainless steel and controlled chaos. Chefs in white jackets barked orders while assistants scurried about with trays of appetizers that cost more than Max usually saw in a month. The head chef stopped dead when he saw Max, his face darkening. "This is what they send me." A street urchin, he spat, turning to Richards. "He'll steal the silverware." Max felt his face burn but kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that defending himself often made things worse. Instead, he focused on memorizing the layout, noting exits and potential escape routes. Street habits died hard. "You'll start with champagne service," Richards instructed, demonstrating the proper way to hold a tray. Don't spill, don't speak unless spoken to, and for God's sake, don't stare at the guests. The tray felt awkward in Max's hands, the crystal glasses tinkling ominously with each movement. As the first guests began to arrive, Max watched from the service area, struck by the stark contrast between their world and his. Women dripped with jewels that could feed his entire street community for years. Men wore watches worth more than most people's cars. Their laughter echoed off marble floors and crystal chandeliers, carefree and confident in their privilege. His first venture into the main ballroom was like entering another planet. The opulence was overwhelming, fresh flowers everywhere, ice sculptures catching the light, music from a string quartet floating through the air. Max moved carefully through the crowd, offering champagne with a practiced smile that masked his growing unease. Well, what have we here? A woman in a red designer dress caught his arm, her jewelry catching the light. Darling, come look at this one. He's actually clean, her companion. An elderly man in a tuxedo peered at Max through his monocle. Remarkable. Davenport does have a talent for finding diamonds in the rough. Max kept his face carefully blank as they discussed him, as if he were an interesting zoo exhibit. More guests gathered, their curiosity piqued by his presence. Their questions came rapid fire, each more invasive than the last. Where do you usually sleep, boy? Have you ever been arrested? Do you actually know how to read? He answered politely but minimally, remembering Richard's instructions. Each response seemed to amuse them further, their laughter growing more pronounced with each glass of champagne. A younger guest, perhaps in his 30s, approached with a particularly cruel smile. I bet he's cased every room already, planning what to steal. The man's companions laughed appreciatively. Should we check his pockets before he leaves? Max's hands tightened on the serving tray, but he maintained his composure. These people's words couldn't hurt him more than hunger or cold already had. Yet each interaction reinforced the massive gulf between their worlds, a gulf that seemed to bring them peculiar pleasure to highlight. Mr. Davenport circulated through the crowd, occasionally catching Max's eye with that same calculating smile from the car. He seemed to be watching Max's interactions with particular interest, as if conducting some sort of social experiment. During a brief respite in the kitchen, Max overheard two servers talking. Davenport does this every year, one whispered. Find some charity case to parade around. Last year it was a reformed drug addict. Year before that, an ex-convict. Entertainment for his guests. The revelation hit Max like a physical blow. He wasn't here as potential help, he was here as entertainment. The realization made his stomach churn, but he couldn't leave. He needed the promised money too desperately. As the evening wore on, the guests grew more intoxicated and less inhibited. Their comments became cruder, their amusement at his presence more obvious. One woman accidentally spilled her drink on him, just to see how he'd react. Another tried to tip him with spare change, laughing at his polite refusal. Only one guest, an elderly man named Walter, showed any genuine kindness. When Max's hand trembled slightly while serving, Walter quietly steadied the tray, shielding the moment from others' view. Their eyes met briefly, and Max saw something there, recognition perhaps, or remembrance of his own struggles. Through it all, Max maintained his dignity, remembering his mother's words about rising above cruelty. But each passing hour felt like an eternity, each interaction a fresh reminder of his place in their eyes, not as a person, but as a curiosity, a form of entertainment for the privileged. The true nature of his role became clearer as the night progressed. Davenport would occasionally guide particularly influential guests to where Max was serving, introducing him with a flourish, "And this is Max, our special guest for the evening." Such an inspiring story of survival on our city streets. The guests would then launch into their practiced shows of concern and charity, all while treating him like a particularly interesting specimen under glass. Their questions were less about understanding and more about satisfying their own morbid curiosity about life on the streets. As midnight approached, Max caught his reflection in one of the massive mirrors lining the ballroom. The uniform fit perfectly, his posture was correct, his smile appropriately deferential. But his eyes told the truth. They were the eyes of someone who had finally understood their role in a cruel game, yet couldn't afford to stop playing. Enjoying Max's story? Want to know what happens next? Will he survive Mr. Davenport's cruel games? Don't miss out! Hit subscribe and the bell to catch all our upcoming stories. Your support means everything to us. The true spectacle began when Mr. Davenport clinked his crystal glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the opulent ballroom, "it's time for some entertainment." His eyes found Max, who was dutifully serving champagne in the corner. "Max, my boy, please join me at the center of the room." Max's heart pounded as he made his way through the crowd, feeling dozens of eyes following his every move. The expensive shoes they'd given him clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. "Our young friend here," Davenport continued, placing a heavy hand on Max's shoulder, "has shown remarkable adaptability tonight, but I wonder his smile turned predatory. How well can he truly adapt to our world?" The guests gathered closer, their interest piqued by the promise of entertainment. Max noticed several of them exchanging knowing looks. They'd seen this before, or something like it. They knew what was coming. "Let's make things interesting, shall we?" Davenport gestured to a corner of the room where servants were unveiling a narrow platform, elevated about 6 feet off the ground. It stretched across a significant portion of the ballroom, its surface gleaming dangerously under the chandelier lights. "A simple challenge," Davenport explained. "Cross the platform while carrying a full tray of champagne. Don't spill a drop and there's a generous reward." He pulled out a thick envelope. $5,000. Enough to change a life, wouldn't you say? The crowd murmured with excitement. Max stared at the platform, his mouth dry. The money was more than he'd ever seen, enough for shelter, food, maybe even resources to search for his mother. But the platform looked treacherous, and something in Davenport's eyes suggested this was just the beginning. "Of course," Davenport added, "we should make it worth our while to watch. Shall we say? Wagers?" "My friends," the guests responded enthusiastically, pulling out wallets and checkbooks. Max watched in horror as they began placing bets, not just on whether he'd succeed or fail, but on how he'd fail. 2,000, says he spills before halfway. 3,000 on a complete fall. I'll put 5,000 on tears before he reaches the end. But the betting grew more animated, more cruel. Max caught sight of Walter, the kind elderly man, standing apart from the crowd, his face a mask of disapproval. But he remained silent, like everyone else who might have objected. "Come now," Max Davenport urged, steering him toward the platform. "Show us what street survival has taught you about. Balance." The tray they handed him was heavy, laden with full champagne flutes. The crystal glasses clinked ominously as Max took his first step onto the platform. The surface was narrower than it had appeared from below, barely wider than his feet. "Careful now," someone called out mockingly. "Those glasses cost more than you do." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Max focused on his breathing, trying to steady his trembling hands. One step, then another. The platform swayed slightly with each movement, making the champagne ripple in the glasses. He was quarter of the way across when the first deliberate disruption came. Mr. Parker, a corpulent man who'd bet heavily on an early fall, bumped the platform's base. The structure shuddered, and Max froze, desperately trying to maintain his balance. "Oops," Parker called out, to appreciative laughter. "Must have had too much champagne myself." Sweat beaded on Max's forehead as he struggled to keep the tray level. A single drop spilled from one glass, drawing excited gasps from the crowd. But he held on, steadying himself through sheer willpower. Look at his face, a woman exclaimed delightedly. He's terrified. Simply delicious. The guests had their phones out now, recording his humiliation for their later entertainment. Max caught fragments of their running commentary. Like a circus animal. Better than last year's entertainment. Davenport really outdid himself this time. Halfway across, another deliberate shake of the platform nearly undid him. The glasses rattled dangerously, but somehow Max maintained control. He could hear money changing hands below as various betting milestones were reached or missed. Impressive balance, Davenport commented, his voice carrying clearly. But then, I suppose sleeping in gutters teaches one all sorts of useful skills. More laughter. More phones recording. More bets being placed. Max felt like a specimen under glass, every weakness, every struggle displayed for their amusement. 3/4 of the way across, Parker tried again, this time more forcefully. The platform lurched and Max had to perform a desperate dance to keep the tray level. One glass tipped precariously, and several guests gasped in anticipation of disaster. Remember, Boyd Davenport called out, waving the envelope. $5,000. Life-changing money for someone like you. Wouldn't want to go back to dumpster diving, would you? The words cut deep, but Max pressed on. Each step was a battle against gravity, against trembling muscles, against the growing certainty that this was all an elaborate setup for his failure. "I'll double my bet," Parker announced. 1,000 says he breaks down crying before he reaches the end. Max thought of his mother, of her lessons about dignity in the face of cruelty. He thought of the street community waiting to hear about his night, of Jenny's worried face when he'd left. He couldn't let them see him break. The final few steps were the hardest. His arms ached, his legs trembled, and the weight of dozens of mocking stares pressed down on him like a physical force. But somehow, impossibly, he made it to the end. Not a single glass had spilled. A mix of disappointed groans and reluctant applause greeted his success. Money changed hands, apparently. Some had bet on his success, though perhaps only to make the betting more interesting. "Well done," Max Davenport approached, still holding the envelope. "But you didn't think it would be that easy, did you? The night is young, and our guests need more. Entertainment." Max's heart sank as he realized this had only been the beginning. The real humiliation was yet to come. He could see it in Davenport's eyes, in the eager anticipation of the crowd, in the way Parker and others were already discussing new betting possibilities. "Perhaps," Davenport continued, his voice carrying a cruel edge, "we should see how our young friend handles other challenges. After all, we must ensure he truly earns his reward." The guests perked up at this suggestion, their earlier disappointment forgotten in the promise of new opportunities for amusement. Max stood still, the now empty tray clutched in his hands like a shield, knowing he was trapped in a game where the rules were rigged against him. But as servants began setting up what appeared to be an even more complex challenge, Max caught Walter's eye again. The elderly man gave him a barely perceptible shake of his head, as if warning him that worse was yet to come. But what choice did Max have? The promise of that money, a potential escape from the streets, kept him rooted in place, even as his instincts screamed at him to run. In a dim corner of the ballroom, Walter discreetly adjusted his cufflinks, which concealed a tiny recording device. Years as a civil rights attorney had taught him to document injustice, and tonight's display of cruelty demanded exposure. He watched as Parker and several other guests huddled together, their whispers carrying sinister undertones. "The platform trick didn't break him," Parker muttered, his face flushed with alcohol and malice. "Time for something more." Entertaining, he slipped something to one of the servants, a bottle that Walter suspected wasn't just champagne. The plan was becoming clear. They intended to humiliate Max completely. The tension in the room grew palpable as Davenport announced the next challenge. "Since our young friend has shown such remarkable balance," he proclaimed, "let's test his serving skills under more dynamic conditions." The floor was being cleared, creating a complex obstacle course of chairs and tables. Walter observed Max's face. Carefully, the boy maintained composure, but fear flickered in his eyes. The attorney had seen that look before, in courtrooms where the powerful crushed the vulnerable. He moved closer, pretending to sip his drink while ensuring his recording device caught everything. This time, Davenport continued, "Max will serve each guest while navigating our little course." But there's a twist. He gestured to Parker, who stepped forward with an exaggerated bow. "Our guests will be free to interact with our server," Parker announced, drawing knowing chuckles from the crowd. "Nothing too rough, of course. We're all civilized here." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. Walter watched as Max was handed a loaded serving tray. The glasses had been filled with the doctored champagne, a detail that made Walter's blood boil. He couldn't intervene directly without losing the evidence he was gathering, but he positioned himself strategically, ready to step in if things went too far. The game began innocently enough. Max carefully navigated between tables while guests placed increasingly difficult drink orders. But soon Parker's true plan emerged. Guests began moving chairs without warning, creating unexpected obstacles. Others stuck out their feet as Max passed, forcing him to jump or stumble. "Oops, clumsy me," a woman giggled as she deliberately bumped into Max, causing him to barely save the tray from tipping. The guests had formed a circle now, like spectators at a gladiatorial arena, their faces masks of cruel anticipation. Parker orchestrated the chaos with subtle gestures, encouraging more aggressive interactions. Phones recorded every moment, their owners hoping to capture the inevitable breakdown. Walter continued his own documentation, his jaw clenched in barely contained anger. "Perhaps our street friend would appreciate some monetary motivation," Parker suggested loudly. "I'll add $1,000 for every successful serving, but subtract $2,000 for every spill." The odds were deliberately impossible, designed to crush any hope of success. Max's composure began to crack under the relentless pressure. His hands trembled slightly, his breathing became labored. Yet he pressed on, each successful delivery a small victory against their cruelty. Walter noticed how the boy's eyes constantly scanned for exit street survival instincts, fighting against the need for promised money. The doctored champagne began taking effect on the guests, making them bolder, crueler. Someone threw a napkin under Max's feet. Another guest accidentally spilled water, creating dangerous slick spots. Parker watched it all with satisfaction, occasionally catching Davenport's eye for approval. "Tell us, boy," a particularly drunk guest called out, "do you miss your mummy? Did she abandon you, or did you run away?" The question hit its mark. Max faltered momentarily, pain flashing across his face. The crowd laughed, scenting blood in the water. Walter moved closer, his recording device capturing every taunt, every deliberate obstacle, every moment of calculated humiliation. He noticed other servants watching from the shadows, their faces showing mixed emotions: sympathy, disgust, relief that they weren't the targets. Parker, frustrated that Max hadn't completely broken yet, implemented his masterstroke. He gestured to several guests who began closing in, creating a tighter circle. The space for navigation became claustrophobic, the air thick with malicious intent. "Getting tired?" Street Rat Parker taunted. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable back in your alley? Though I must say, you've provided excellent entertainment." He reached out, as if to pat Max's shoulder, deliberately jostling the tray. Walter watched in horror as the situation escalated. The guests, emboldened by alcohol and cruelty, began a game of cat and mouse, forcing Max to twist and turn in increasingly dangerous ways. The boy's face had gone pale, his earlier composure cracking under the sustained assault on his dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Davenport announced, raising his voice above the commotion. "Shall we raise the stakes? Perhaps our young friend would appreciate a real challenge." He nodded to several servants who began rearranging the room again, creating what appeared to be an even more treacherous course. Walter could see Max's resolve wavering. The boy's eyes darted between the exit and the envelope of money Davenport still tantalizingly displayed. It was a cruel calculation, dignity versus desperate need. The attorney had seen this scenario play out countless times in different forms, always with the powerful exploiting the vulnerable. The tension reached a breaking point as Parker implemented his final act of sabotage. He accidentally spilled his drink near Max's feet, while simultaneously signaling another guest to bump into the boy from behind. The combination would have sent anyone sprawling, but Max's street-honed reflexes saved him barely. "Most impressive," Parker sneered, his voice carrying clearly in Walter's recording. "But how long can you keep this up, boy? We have all night to entertain ourselves, and you've proven such an amusing diversion." Walter noticed several guests beginning to look uncomfortable with the escalating cruelty, but none spoke up. Their silence made them complicit, a fact his recording would make painfully clear. He watched as Max struggled to maintain his dignity while being treated as less than human by those who claimed to be his social betters. The night had become a study in calculated degradation, each challenge designed to strip away another layer of Max's humanity for the amusement of the privileged. Walter's evidence would expose this ugly display of power and prejudice, but for now he could only watch and document as the cruelty continued to unfold. The grand doors of the ballroom swung open, momentarily halting the cruel entertainment as Henry Lewis, one of the city's most prominent business figures, made his unexpected entrance. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers rippling through the assembly. Lewis wasn't known for attending Davenport's parties. Their business rivalry was legendary. Henry Davenport called out, momentarily forgetting his torment of Max. "What an unexpected pleasure!" The strain in his voice was evident. Henry Lewis's presence threatened to disrupt his carefully orchestrated evening of cruelty. Lewis moved through the crowd with natural authority, his expression unreadable. "Richard," he acknowledged Davenport coolly. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene before him: the obstacle course, the recording phones, the obvious signs of orchestrated humiliation. Max, still holding his serving tray, had retreated to a corner, trying to catch his breath and steady his nerves. He kept his eyes down, following the servant's cardinal rule of invisibility, but something about the newcomer's voice made him look up. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. Henry Lewis stopped mid-stride, the color draining from his face. The crystal glass he held slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. "It can't be," Lewis whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. He took a step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving Max's face. "My God, Max." Max stared back, memories flooding his mind, fragments of a life before the streets, a voice reading bedtime stories, strong hands teaching him to ride a bike, the scent of aftershave and safety. "Dad," the word escaped his lips as barely a whisper, the serving tray clattering to the floor from his trembling hands. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Guests stood frozen, phones still recording, as father and son moved toward each other, as if in a trance. Henry reached out a trembling hand, touching Max's face with infinite gentleness. "My boy," he choked out. "My son, we've searched." For so long his voice broke as he pulled Max into a fierce embrace. Max stood rigid for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of physical contact and emotion. Then, like a dam breaking, he collapsed into his father's arms, years of stored grief and loneliness pouring out in racking sobs. "I got lost," Max managed between tears. "The mall. Christmas. I couldn't find my way back." "We never stopped looking," Henry said fiercely, his own tears falling freely now. "Not for one day. Your mother, she never gave up hope." The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. Davenport's face had turned ashen, the full implications of his evening's entertainment becoming horrifyingly clear. he had orchestrated the humiliation of Henry Lewis's long-lost son. "My God," someone whispered. "The street boy is Henry Lewis's heir." Henry suddenly became aware of their surroundings, of the phones still recording, of the evidence of cruelty scattered around the room. His expression hardened as he took in the obstacle course, the betting slips, the spilled drinks. "What have they been doing to you?" he asked Max softly, though his eyes blazed with fury. Before Max could answer, Walter stepped forward, holding out his phone. "I have everything recorded, Mr. Lewis. Every moment of it." His voice was gentle but firm. "They've been entertaining themselves at your son's expense." Henry's jaw clenched as he listened to snippets of the recording, the taunts, the bets, the deliberate harassment. His arms tightened protectively around Max. "Dad," Max whispered, still hardly believing he could use that word again, "I didn't know it was you. I couldn't remember your face clearly. Just feelings, fragments." "You were so young when we lost you," Henry replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I would have known you anywhere. You have your mother's eyes." The mention of his mother made Max's breath catch. "Mom? Is she?" "She's alive, son. At home. Waiting like she has every night for 7 years." Henry pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I need to call her. She needs to know." The crowd began to stir uncomfortably, many trying to edge toward the exits. Davenport's elegant soiree had transformed into a potential catastrophe. Parker, in particular, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Henry's call was brief, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Sophia. I found him. I found our boy." The sound of a woman's cry could be heard through the phone, making Max's heart clench. As Henry ended the call, his expression shifted from joy to cold fury. He turned to face Davenport, who had been trying to quietly retreat. "Richard," his voice could have frozen flame, "we have much to discuss about tonight's entertainment." "Henry, I had no idea," Davenport stammered. "It was just a bit of fun, team building, character development." "Character development," Henry's laugh was without humor. "You made my son, my missing child, perform like a circus animal for your guests' amusement." He gestured to Walter. "And thankfully, we have it all documented." The implications hung heavy in the air. Henry Lewis had the power to destroy careers, ruin reputations, and crush businesses, and everyone in that room had participated in or witnessed the humiliation of his son. "Max," Henry said softly, turning back to his son, "let's get you home. Your mother is waiting." He removed his jacket and wrapped it around Max's shoulders, the gesture both protective and symbolic, covering the servant's uniform that had been part of his humiliation. As they moved toward the exit, Henry stopped and addressed the silent crowd. "This evening's entertainment is over, but I promise you the consequences are just beginning." The walk to Henry's car was surreal. Max felt disconnected from reality, as if he might wake up at any moment back in his hidden corner of the loading dock. His father's arm around his shoulders was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I lived on the streets," Max blurted out, suddenly afraid his father would be ashamed. I did what I had to do to survive." Henry stopped, turning Max to face him. "Listen to me, son. You survived. You kept your dignity, your humanity. I saw that tonight, how you handled their cruelty with grace. I've never been prouder." In the car, Max stared out the window as they left the wealthy neighborhood, his mind spinning with questions. How? How did you end up at the party?" Henry's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "One of my business contacts mentioned Davenport was hosting another of his special entertainment evenings. I went to gather evidence of his cruel games. I never imagined." His voice broke again. As they drove through the city, Max pointed out places that had been significant in his street life: the library, where he'd continued his education, the restaurant where Tony had sometimes fed him, the spots where he'd helped others survive. Henry listened intently, each detail of his son's lost years simultaneously precious and painful. "You've lived through so much," he said finally. "But you're coming home now. For good. The car turned into an exclusive neighborhood, approaching a large house that triggered more fragments of memory in Max's mind. "I remember the treehouse," he whispered. "In the backyard. You built it for my 7th birthday." "It's still there," Henry replied softly. "Your mother wouldn't let me take it down. She said you'd need it when you came home." They pulled into the driveway, and before the car had fully stopped, the front door flew open. A woman ran out into the night, her dark hair streaming behind her. Mum, Max breathed, his heart racing as more memories crystallized her smile, her laugh, the way she'd sing him to sleep. Sophia Lewis reached the car just as Max stepped out. For a moment they stood frozen, taking each other in. Then, with a cry that held 7 years of grief and longing, she gathered her son into her arms. "My baby," she sobbed, covering his face with kisses. "My beautiful boy, you've come back to me." Max buried his face in her neck, breathing in her familiar scent. She still wore the same perfume. "I tried to find my way back," he whispered. "I'm sorry, I got so lost." "No, my love," she pulled back to look at him through her tears. "We lost you. We should have protected you better. But you're home now. You're finally home." The three of them stood in the driveway, clinging to each other, their tears mingling in the night air. 7 years of separation, of searching, of hope and despair, dissolved in the miracle of reunion. But even in this moment of joy, Henry's mind was already working, planning. Those who had hurt his son would face justice. The evidence Walter had gathered would ensure that. But first his family needed to heal, to reconnect, to become whole again. "Come inside," Sophia said finally, keeping one arm firmly around Max, as if afraid he might disappear again. "You must be hungry. I'll make you anything you want." Max hesitated at the threshold of his childhood home, overwhelmed by the flood of memories. "Everything's the same," he whispered, touching the doorframe where pencil marks still recorded his childhood height. "Your room is exactly as you left it," Sophia told him. "I kept it ready, always ready for you to come home." As they stepped inside, Max felt the years on the street beginning to fall away like a heavy cloak. He was still that lost little boy, but he was also a survivor who had maintained his humanity against all odds. And now, finally, he was home. During that first night home, as Max slept in his childhood bed, Henry and Sophia sat in their living room, reliving the nightmare of the past 7 years. The walls were covered with maps marked with search areas, missing person posters, and timelines, a testament to their relentless quest to find their son. "Remember the first month?" Sophia whispered, clutching a photo album. "We hired every private investigator in the city." The pages showed their increasingly desperate search posters being hung, volunteer search parties combing the streets, press conferences pleading for information. Henry nodded, his face haunted. "I had our corporate security team working round the clock. We searched every hospital, every shelter." He paused, remembering the countless false leads, the midnight phone calls that led nowhere, the gradual erosion of hope. The flashbacks came in waves. The day they'd thought they'd found him in a foster home 3 states away, only to discover it was another boy with similar features. The Christmas they'd kept his presents wrapped, convinced he'd come home any day. The birthday cake Sophia still baked every year, only to cry over untouched slices. "Your therapy sessions," Henry said softly, taking his wife's hand. "Dr. Mitchell said you were torturing yourself, keeping his room exactly as it was." Sophia's therapy sessions had been intense, filled with guilt and what-ifs. "I can still hear Dr. Mitchell's voice," she admitted. "Sophia, you need to accept the possibility, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. A mother knows, Henry. I knew he was alive." The sessions had revealed the depth of their trauma. Sophia had been diagnosed with PTSD, experiencing flashbacks to the moment she realized Max was gone. She'd wake up screaming, convinced she could hear him calling for her in the mall crowd. "I stopped going to therapy when Dr. Mitchell suggested we hold a memorial service," she said, her voice bitter. He called it closure, but how could I close my heart to my son? As they talked, a different story emerged across town. In his study, Davenport poured himself another drink, his hands shaking as he opened an old file. Inside was the truth he'd never shared, the real reason for his cruel entertainment. 20 years ago, his own son had disappeared. Unlike Max, Timothy Davenport had never been found. The police concluded he'd likely been taken by a trafficking ring. The case went cold, leaving Davenport with a hole in his heart that festered into bitterness. You see, Timothy spoke to his son's picture. I had to show them. Show them all how easily children can vanish, how the streets can swallow them whole, his annual entertainment. It had been a twisted form of revenge against a world that had taken his child, making privileged parents face the reality of lost children. But targeting Max, unknowingly torturing Henry Lewis's son, had been his fatal mistake. The irony was crushing. His attempt to process his own loss had led him to traumatize another lost child who had finally found his way home. Back at the Lewis home, Sophia pulled out boxes of newspaper clippings, each one a potential lead they'd followed. We must have walked every street in the city, she remembered, showing his picture, asking if anyone had seen him. Henry's business associates had thought he was obsessed, endangering his company with his single-minded focus on the search, but he'd refused to give up. I added Max's photo to every corporate presentation, he recalled. Made our entire organization part of the search. The therapy sessions had revealed other costs. Their marriage had nearly crumbled under the weight of grief and guilt. Sophia had blamed herself for letting go of Max's hand. Henry had blamed himself for not being there that day. Dr. Mitchell said we were keeping each other trapped in the moment of loss, Sophia said. But how could we move forward when part of our hearts was missing? They'd tried different therapists, support groups for parents of missing children, even psychics who claimed they could locate Max. Each dead end had carved new scars on their souls. Remember the medium who said she saw him near water? Henry's laugh was hollow. We spent weeks searching every dock, every fountain, every pond in the city. The search had consumed their lives. Henry had established a foundation for missing children, using his business resources to help other families. Sophia had channeled her grief into advocacy, pushing for better emergency response protocols in shopping centers. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Davenport was facing his own demons. His annual parties had been more than mere entertainment. They were carefully orchestrated recreations of loss. Each year he'd choose someone vulnerable, someone lost, and force society to confront their existence. I made them see, he muttered, surrounded by files of past entertainment subjects. Made them understand how it feels to watch someone's child suffer. The psychological reports from his own therapy sessions, abandoned years ago, painted a picture of a man consumed by unresolved grief. His therapist had warned about his increasing obsession with lost children, his compulsion to control and manipulate situations that reminded him of his loss. As dawn approached, Henry and Sophia finally went upstairs to check on Max. He was sleeping peacefully, one hand clutching his old stuffed bear, found exactly where he'd left it 7 years ago. We never gave up, Sophia whispered, touching his hair gently. Every birthday cake, every Christmas stocking, every empty chair at dinner, they were promises that we'd find you. The truth about Davenport's motivation would come out in the following days, adding another layer of tragedy to an already complex story. His own loss had driven him to create scenarios of suffering, as if forcing others to confront the reality of missing children could somehow fill the void left by his own son. But for now, in the quiet of early morning, one family's search had ended in miracle, while another's continued in darkness. The years of therapy, the endless searches, the maintained hope, all had led to this moment of healing, even as they revealed the deep scars left by absence and longing. The morning after the reunion brought chaos to Davenport's mansion. News vans crowded the entrance, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like accusing fingers. Inside, Davenport paced his study, watching his carefully constructed world crumble through the wall of windows. The footage from Walter's recording had gone viral overnight. Clips of Max's humiliation played on every local channel, interspersed with the dramatic revelation of his identity. The public reaction was immediate, and savage social media exploded with outrage, and protesters gathered outside Davenport's gates. Henry Lewis arrived just before noon, his car cutting through the media circus with grim determination. He wasn't alone. Accompanying him were his lawyers, Walter with his evidence, and several police officers. The security cameras caught his approach, and Davenport felt his chest tighten with fear. "Mr. Davenport," his secretary's voice trembled over the intercom. "Mr. Lewis is here. He's insisting on seeing you." Before Davenport could respond, the study doors burst open. Henry Lewis stood there, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, Walter quietly set up his recording equipment. This confrontation would be documented too. 7 years, Henry's voice was deadly quiet. 7 years we searched for our son. And you, he took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. You turned his suffering into entertainment. Davenport backed away, bumping into his desk. "Henry, please. I didn't know he was your son. It was just a party game, a bit of social commentary." Social commentary? Henry's laugh was harsh. "I've seen the footage, all of it. The platform game, the obstacle course. Parker's sabotage attempts. You orchestrated every moment of his humiliation." The police officers moved to strategic positions around the room, sensing the growing tension. Walter continued recording, his camera capturing every moment of the confrontation. "You know what I saw in that footage?" Richard Henry advanced another step. "I saw my son, my missing child, being treated like an animal for your guests' amusement. I saw him being pushed, mocked, degraded, while you stood there, smiling, directing it all like some twisted circus ringmaster." Davenport's face had gone pale. There were others before him. Other lost souls we helped, entertained. Others. Henry's voice rose sharply. How many? How many vulnerable people have you tormented for your guests' pleasure?" The question hung in the air as Walter pulled out a file. "I've been investigating Mr. Davenport's parties for months," he said quietly. "There's a pattern. Every year, he finds someone vulnerable, homeless individuals, reformed addicts, recently released prisoners. They're promised money, opportunity. Instead, they get public humiliation," Henry finished, "psychological torture dressed up as entertainment for the wealthy." The police officers exchanged glances, one of them speaking into his radio. More units were arriving outside, their sirens adding to the media circus atmosphere. Davenport seemed to collapse in on himself, sinking into his chair. "You don't understand. None of you understand. My son, Timothy." "Your son?" Henry's voice caught. "What about your son?" He disappeared. 20 years ago, Davenport's words came out in a rush. The police never found him. The rich, powerful parents at my children's school, they stopped inviting us to parties. Stopped letting their children mention Timothy's name. They wanted to forget, to pretend it couldn't happen to them. Understanding dawned on Henry's face, quickly replaced by disgust. "So this was your revenge? Forcing privileged people to confront the reality of lost children by tormenting the vulnerable." "I made them see," Davenport suddenly shouted, standing up. "Made them feel what it's like to watch a child suffer and be able to do nothing. Made them face what they wanted to ignore." The outburst caused the police officers to step forward, hands moving to their weapons. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. "Your pain," Henry said quietly, dangerously, "does not justify causing pain to others. My son lived on the streets for 7 years. 7 years of hunger, fear, and loneliness. And you turned his survival into a spectacle." More police were entering the study now, responding to their colleagues' calls. They carried evidence bags, warrant papers, determined expressions. "Mr. Davenport," one officer stepped forward. "We have warrants to search the premises. We'll need access to all records of your previous events." The media outside had somehow caught wind of the police presence. The camera flashes through the windows increased, creating a strobe effect that made the scene seem even more surreal. You'll find records in the safe Walter supplied, behind the painting. I have footage of him opening it during previous parties. Davenport lunged forward suddenly. Whether to stop the officers or attack Henry wasn't clear. Multiple things happened at once. Officers rushed to restrain him. Henry stepped back into a defensive stance, and Walter's camera captured everything. "You've destroyed me," Davenport spat as the officers held him. "My reputation, my social standing, everything I've built." "No," Henry corrected coldly. "You destroyed yourself. Every time you chose to hurt someone vulnerable. Every time you turned suffering into entertainment. My son was just the last straw." The officers began reading Davenport his rights as others started their search. The evidence they would find was damning detailed records of past entertainments, financial transactions showing payments and betting pools, even videos of previous parties. "The DA will want to speak with previous victims," one officer told Henry, "if your son is willing to testify." "He's been through enough," Henry cut in sharply. "The video should be sufficient. I won't have him relive that trauma in court." The media coverage was immediate and devastating. Walter's footage, combined with clips from guests' phones, painted a damning picture. Society columns that had once praised Davenport's charitable events now condemned his cruelty. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice. Former victims began coming forward, sharing their stories of humiliation at Davenport's parties. Each account added to the growing wave of public outrage. The wealthy guests who had participated, laughed, and bet on human suffering found themselves facing their own reckonings. Parker's role in the events drew particular criticism. Security footage showed him deliberately sabotaging Max's challenges, his cruel manipulation caught in high definition. His business partners quickly distanced themselves, his social standing crumbling like a house of cards. As the police led Davenport out through the media gauntlet, Henry watched from the study window. The man's fall from grace was complete, his twisted attempts at processing his own loss having finally caught up with him. "It wasn't just about Max," Walter said quietly, standing beside Henry. "Though finding him was a miracle, it was about all of them, all the vulnerable people Davenport targeted over the years." Henry nodded grimly. "Make sure every bit of evidence is preserved. Every record, every video, every witness statement. No one should ever have the power to turn human suffering into entertainment." The footage continued to spread, sparking broader discussions about privilege, power, and the treatment of society's vulnerable members. Max's story, from lost child to survivor to catalyst for change, became a symbol of both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. Outside, the protesters had turned their anger into calls for action, demands for better support systems for the homeless, stronger oversight of private events, accountability for the wealthy and powerful. Max's 7 years on the streets had exposed deep societal wounds that could no longer be ignored. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. News vans camped outside the Lewis mansion, their satellite trucks lining the quiet suburban street. Headlines screamed across every platform: "Lost heir found shocking abuse at elite party, billionaire's son survives 7 years on streets." Davenport's cruel games exposed. Inside, the Lewis family tried to shield Max from the chaos. Sophia had drawn all the curtains, creating a protective cocoon around their reunited family. But the stories kept coming, each outlet adding new layers to the narrative: interviews with street vendors who'd known Max, security footage from the mall on the day he disappeared, tearful testimonies from the street community who'd helped him survive. "They're calling it the story of the decade," Henry said, switching off the television where reporters endlessly dissected every detail. "Everyone wants an interview, wants to hear your story." Max, curled up on the couch between his parents, shook his head. "I don't want to talk to them." Not yet. He was still processing the whirlwind of changes, sleeping in a real bed, having regular meals, being surrounded by family after so long alone. The media painted different versions of the same story. Some focused on the rags to riches angle, others on the social justice implications of Davenport's cruel entertainment. Amateur sleuths online pieced together Max's street life, mapping his survival through the city's shadows. "Look at this," Sophia whispered, showing Henry a viral video of Jenny, tears streaming down her face, describing how Max had shared his food with younger street kids. "Our son never lost his humanity, even when the world turned its back on him." The reunion itself became a symbol of hope. People shared their own stories of lost family members, inspired by the Lewis family's refusal to give up. The pencil marks on the doorframe marking Max's childhood height, the preserved bedroom, Sophia's yearly birthday cakes, these details touched hearts worldwide. The immediate aftermath brought challenges they hadn't expected. Max would wake up disoriented, momentarily forgetting he was home. The soft bed felt wrong after years of hard surfaces. The abundance of food overwhelmed him. He'd catch himself hiding rolls from dinner in his pockets, street habits dying hard. "It's okay," Sophia would say, finding him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., checking if the food was still there. "We have plenty. You'll never go hungry again." The family's adjustment period was both beautiful and painful. Max struggled with simple things, using proper utensils after years of eating with his hands, sleeping through the night in complete silence, accepting that he didn't need to earn his place in the family. Henry took leave from his company, prioritizing his son's reintegration. They spent hours together, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Max would ask about the years he'd missed, and Henry would share stories of their relentless search. "We never replaced anything in your room," Henry explained, watching Max rediscover his childhood belongings. "Your mother said it needed to stay exactly as you left it, so you'd know we were waiting." The media's attention brought unexpected consequences. People recognized Max on the street, wanting to touch him, as if his survival story might rub off on them. Former guests from Davenport's party reached out with tearful apologies, their remorse fueled by public shame. Sophia became fiercely protective, screening all contact with the outside world. "He needs time," she'd tell persistent reporters. "He's been through enough without becoming your headline." The street community that had helped Max survive found themselves in the spotlight too. Henry made sure they were taken care of: jobs, housing, support services. "They protected my son," he told his board of directors. "Now we protect them." Tony's restaurant, where Max had sometimes worked for food, became an unlikely tourist attraction. Tony himself refused all interviews, simply hanging a photo of Max in his kitchen with the words "Always welcome here." The immediate aftermath also brought legal challenges. Prosecutors wanted Max's testimony against Davenport, while civil lawyers saw potential lawsuits against party guests who'd participated in his humiliation. The family dealt with it all together, prioritizing Max's emotional well-being above any legal victories. Sometimes late at night, they'd find Max standing at his bedroom window, looking out at the street. "Missing your friends out there?" Sophia would ask gently. "No," he'd reply, his voice distant. "Just reminding myself this is real, that I'm really home." The media frenzy eventually began to die down, but the story's impact lingered. It had exposed uncomfortable truths about society's treatment of the vulnerable, about wealth and power, about the thin line between entertainment and cruelty. For the Lewis family, each day brought new challenges and victories. Max's first family dinner without hiding food. His first full night's sleep in his bed. The first time he called out "Mom" without hesitation. Each moment was precious, a step toward healing. As the immediate shock of reunion settled into routine, they began creating new traditions while honoring old ones. Sophia still baked birthday cakes, but now Max was there to blow out the candles. The height marks on the doorframe got new additions, measuring growth delayed but not denied. The media might have moved on to new stories, but for the Lewis family, their own story was just beginning, not the headline-grabbing reunion, but the quiet, daily miracle of being whole again. The events that unfolded in Max's life were nothing short of extraordinary, but his journey is far from over. If you've been moved by his story and want to follow more captivating tales that explore the depths of human resilience, hit that subscribe button. Join us as we continue to share stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the strength that lies within each of us. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The aftermath of Davenport's downfall sent shockwaves through high society. His empire crumbled with stunning speed. Business partners withdrew, social connections evaporated, and his reputation lay in tatters. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now found himself alone in his mansion, watching his world dissolve. Securities investigators uncovered years of questionable dealings, as if the exposure of his cruel parties had opened a Pandora's box of corruption. His company's stock plummeted, taking with it the fortunes of many who had attended his infamous gatherings. The karmic justice was not lost on observers. But the true tragedy emerged when reporters dug deeper into Davenport's past. The story of his lost son, Timothy, revealed a broken man who had channeled his grief into cruelty. Old photographs showed a different Davenport, smiling, gentle, holding a small boy who bore his features. That man had died with Timothy's disappearance. His wife, who had maintained a dignified silence throughout the scandal, finally filed for divorce. Her statement was brief but devastating. "I lost my son 20 years ago. I lost my husband the same day, though I didn't realize it then." The psychological toll became evident as Davenport was seen wandering his empty mansion, talking to portraits of Timothy. His staff quietly resigned, one by one, until only the echoes of his footsteps kept him company. Meanwhile, the street community faced its own upheaval. The media attention had exposed both the harsh realities of homeless life and the surprising bonds forged in hardship. Some found opportunity in the spotlight: job offers, housing assistance, chances for education. Others retreated deeper into the shadows, wary of public attention. Jenny, now staying at a youth shelter funded by the Lewis Foundation, struggled with survivor's guilt. Why did Max get his miracle, she would ask counselors. What about the rest of us? The street vendors and shop owners who had shown Max kindness found themselves interviewed, their small acts of decency magnified by media attention. Tony's restaurant became a symbol of compassion, though Tony himself remained gruffly modest about his role in Max's survival. For Max, watching Davenport's fall brought complicated emotions. He did terrible things, he told his parents, but seeing him broken like this, remembering how he lost his son, the empathy that had helped him survive the streets now extended, surprisingly, to his tormentor. The Lewis family faced their own challenges. Max's years on the street had left deep psychological scars. He hoarded food in his room, startled at sudden movements, and struggled with accepting help. Night terrors plagued his sleep, filled with memories of cold alleys and empty stomachs. Sophia found him one night organizing his closet into emergency packs ready to run if everything disappeared again. She sat with him until dawn, helping him sort through clothes while quietly crying at this evidence of her son's ongoing trauma. Henry threw himself into advocacy work, establishing programs for homeless youth. But his anger at Davenport and the party guests simmered beneath his philanthropic efforts. The footage of his son's humiliation haunted his dreams. The family's therapy sessions revealed layers of pain. Max struggled with guilt over inadvertently causing Davenport's destruction. Sophia battled anxiety about losing Max again. Henry worked to balance his protective instincts with Max's need for independence. Parker, who had so cruelly tormented Max at the party, faced his own downfall. His business collapsed as clients fled the toxic association. His family's social standing, built over generations, crumbled in weeks. He was last seen checking into a rehabilitation facility, broken by public shame and private guilt. The wealthy guests who had participated in Max's humiliation found themselves ostracized. Their names appeared in news reports, their cruel laughter preserved in Walter's recordings. Some attempted damage control through charitable donations. Others simply disappeared from public life, their reputations unsalvageable. Walter's evidence continued to yield devastating revelations. Previous victims of Davenport's entertainment emerged with similar stories of manipulation and cruelty. Each testimony added to the growing picture of systematic abuse masked as social commentary. But perhaps the most poignant tragedy was found in Davenport's private study. Police discovered journals dating back to Timothy's disappearance, chronicling his descent from grieving father to cruel orchestrator of suffering. The final entry, written the night of Max's humiliation, read simply, "I'm sorry, Timothy. I became the monster I feared." The psychological impact rippled through society. Wealthy parents hugged their children closer, haunted by the knowledge that privilege offered no protection against loss. Social events became more subdued, the appetite for exotic entertainment dimmed by guilt and self-reflection. For the street community, the tragedy brought unwanted attention. Well-meaning but naive volunteers flooded their spaces, armed with cameras and good intentions. The delicate ecosystem of survival, built on trust and unspoken rules, struggled under the spotlight. Max watched it all from the safety of his recovered home, understanding better than most the complexity of tragedy. He saw how Davenport's unresolved grief had poisoned his soul, how power and privilege had enabled cruelty, how pain could transform ordinary people into monsters or heroes. The fall of Davenport's empire revealed the fragility of wealth built on others' suffering. His mansion, once a symbol of power, stood empty, a monument to grief twisted into malice. The rooms where he had staged his cruel entertainments gathered dust, their echoes of laughter replaced by silence. In the end, the greatest tragedy was the waste of potential, of compassion, of human connection. Davenport had tried to process his loss by inflicting loss on others, creating a cycle of pain that ultimately consumed him. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unresolved grief and the seductive power of cruelty masked as justice. The truth emerged in layers, like peeling an onion of secrets. It began when Eli arrived at the Lewis Foundation's new youth shelter, his haunted eyes and familiar mannerisms catching Max's attention immediately. There was something about the way he moved, the way he watched exits. It spoke of shared trauma. During a group session, Eli's story spilled out. He had been at Sterling Mall that fateful Christmas day, not as a shopper, but as part of a child trafficking operation. His role had been to create diversions, allowing others to target vulnerable children in the chaos. "I was there," Eli whispered, unable to meet Max's eyes. "I started the panic that separated you from your mother." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt, sending shockwaves through the room. Max sat frozen, memories of that day suddenly sharp and clear, the sudden surge of people, the screaming, the hand that had deliberately pushed between him and his mother. Walter, who had maintained contact with the Lewis family since the Davenport incident, began investigating immediately. His expertise in documenting injustice proved invaluable as he uncovered connections that had remained hidden for 7 years. The trafficking ring had operated with frightening efficiency, created chaos in crowded venues to snatch children. But they hadn't counted on Max's street smarts and survival instincts. He had managed to escape during the initial confusion, disappearing into the city rather than falling into their hands. More surprising connections emerged. Parker, who had so cruelly tormented Max at Davenport's party, was revealed to have ties to the same criminal network. His sabotage attempts during the party had been partially motivated by recognition he had been one of the financial beneficiaries of the trafficking operation. The evidence trail led to an even more shocking discovery. Timothy Davenport's disappearance 20 years ago had been orchestrated by the same organization. His father's descent into cruelty had been manipulated by the very people who had profited from his son's loss. They were hiding in plain sight, Walter explained, spreading photographs across the Lewis's dining room table, using high society events to select targets, using grief-stricken parents' wealth to fund their operations. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Ely's testimony proved crucial. As a former insider turned informant, he provided details that helped authorities begin dismantling the network. His own story, recruited as a homeless child, trained to help steal other children, highlighted the cycle of exploitation that had claimed so many victims. For Max, understanding the true circumstances of his separation from his family brought mixed emotions. The random tragedy of getting lost had been replaced by the calculated cruelty of human trafficking. Yet he had beaten the odds, his street survival denying the criminals their prize. The revelation about Parker's involvement explained his particular viciousness at the party. He had recognized Max, realizing that this survivor could potentially expose their operation. His attempts to humiliate and discredit Max had been driven by fear as much as cruelty. Walter's meticulous documentation expanded beyond the Davenport party. He had unknowingly captured evidence of trafficking network members attending such events, using social gatherings as cover for their operations. The footage became crucial in building cases against high society criminals who had hidden behind respectability. Perhaps the most poignant discovery was found in Davenport's private papers' letters from the trafficking ring, subtly taunting him about Timothy's fate while pretending to offer help finding him. They had manipulated his grief, pushing him toward increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty that served their purposes. Ely's presence at the shelter created complex dynamics. Max found himself helping the person who had inadvertently altered the course of his life. Their shared understanding of survival and manipulation created a unique bond: victims turned survivors, working to prevent others from facing similar fates. The truth about that Christmas Day changed everything. What had seemed like a tragic accident was revealed as a carefully orchestrated crime. The years Max spent on the streets, while traumatic, had ironically saved him from a far worse fate. As the full picture emerged, other families affected by the trafficking ring began to find answers. Some discoveries brought closure, others brought fresh grief. Each revelation reinforced the importance of the Lewis Foundation's work with vulnerable youth. The exposure of the trafficking network created new opportunities for healing. Survivors connected with each other, sharing stories and support. The foundation became a hub for recovery, turning tragedy into triumph as more young people found their way to safety and rehabilitation. Max and Ely, understanding their shared history, led to a powerful partnership in helping others. Their first-hand knowledge of both the streets and the trafficking network made them uniquely qualified to identify and protect vulnerable youth. The truth had finally come to light, bringing with it both justice and understanding. The random cruelty of fate had been replaced by human cruelty, but also by human resilience, survival, and ultimately redemption. 1 year after the revelations that shook high society, the Lewis Foundation had become a beacon of hope for street children. The former Davenport mansion, acquired in a poetic twist of justice, had been transformed into a state-of-the-art youth center. Where once cruel entertainment had reigned, now healing and hope flourished. Max stood in what had been the ballroom, now converted into a communal space filled with comfortable furniture and learning areas. The platform where he had been humiliated was gone, replaced by a stage where young people could express themselves through art and music. The transformation was both physical and symbolic. "Ready for the anniversary ceremony?" Ely asked, joining him. Their friendship, forged in shared trauma and dedication to helping others, had become one of the Foundation's greatest strengths. Together, they had developed programs specifically designed for trafficking survivors and street youth. The day's event would celebrate not just survival, but transformation. The Foundation had helped hundreds of young people off the streets, providing education, therapy, and most importantly, a chance at a future. Each success story was a tribute to Max's journey from lost child to advocate. But Henry and Sophia watched proudly as Max addressed the gathered crowd: former street kids, donors, social workers, and even some Reformed Party guests seeking redemption through charitable work. Their son had grown into a powerful speaker, his experiences lending authenticity to his words. "We're not just providing shelter," Max explained, his voice carrying clearly through the renovated ballroom. "We're creating family. The kind of family I found on the streets, people who look out for each other, who share what little they have, who understand that survival isn't just about food and shelter. It's about maintaining your humanity." The foundation's success stories filled the room. Jenny, now studying social work at university, sat beside Tony, whose restaurant had become a job training site for foundation youth. Sarah, the elderly woman who had shared her blankets during cold nights, worked as a house mother in the residential program. Walter, still documenting everything, but now focusing on positive changes instead of cruel entertainment, captured the moments of triumph. His cameras recorded testimonials from young people who had found their way from darkness to light, their stories adding to the foundation's growing impact. In an unexpected development, some of Davenport's party guests had become the foundation's strongest supporters. Their guilt over participating in Max's humiliation transformed into dedication to making amends. Their social connections and resources, once used for cruel entertainment, now served to help vulnerable youth. The most surprising guest at the ceremony was Davenport himself, released from psychiatric care and seeking his own redemption. Max had visited him during his treatment, their conversations helping both to heal. Davenport's insights into manipulation and power had proved valuable in protecting other vulnerable youth. "I lost my son," Davenport addressed the gathering, his voice heavy with emotion, "and in my grief I became something monstrous. But through Max's forgiveness and the Foundation's work, I found a way to honor Timothy's memory by helping other lost children find their way home." The Foundation's programs had expanded beyond immediate rescue. They now included education initiatives, job training, family reunification services, and advocacy for policy changes. Max's experience had shown that survival required more than just meeting basic needs. It required opportunity and support. Sophia had developed a special program for parents of missing children, drawing on her own experience of maintaining hope through years of separation. Her support groups helped families cope with loss while continuing their search, understanding that hope and healing could coexist. Henry's business acumen had proven invaluable in creating sustainable programs. The Foundation's social enterprise initiatives provided job training while generating income to support more youth. The model was being replicated in other cities, creating a network of support for vulnerable young people. The ceremony included a special moment of recognition for the street community that had helped Max survive. Their wisdom and compassion, born of hardship, now informed the Foundation's approach to helping others. Their understanding of street life proved invaluable in reaching young people who distrusted traditional institutions. As the event concluded, Max led tours through the renovated mansion. The rooms that had once witnessed cruelty now housed classrooms, counseling centers, and safe spaces for healing. The kitchen, where he had once served drinks in humiliation, now trained young people in culinary skills. "This is what transformation looks like," Max explained to visitors. "Not just changing a building, but changing lives. Every young person who finds safety here, every family reunited, every survivor who becomes a helper, they're part of this transformation." The Foundation's success had inspired others. Similar centers were opening in other cities, creating a network of support for vulnerable youth. The model of combining practical help with emotional healing, developed through Max's experience, was proving effective in breaking cycles of poverty and exploitation. As night fell on the anniversary celebration, the Lewis family gathered in what had once been Davenport's study. The wall of shame, where he had documented his cruel entertainments, now displayed success stories, photographs of reunited families, and testimonials from young people who had found their way to better lives. "Did you ever imagine," Sophia asked, holding Max's hand, "that your journey would lead to this? That your survival would help so many others survive?" Max looked around at the transformed space, at the evidence of lives changed and hope restored. "On the streets," he replied, I learned that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about keeping your heart alive too. That's what we're doing here, helping people keep their hearts alive until they find their way home. The Foundation's work continued to evolve, addressing new challenges and finding new ways to help vulnerable youth. But its core mission remained unchanged. Inspired by one lost boy's journey home, it offered others the chance to find their own way back from darkness to light. The story of Max Lewis, from lost child to survivor to champion for others, had become more than just a tale of reunion. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of compassion, and the possibility of transforming tragedy into triumph. In the depths of our darkest moments, when all seems lost and the world turns its back, remember this: your pain doesn't define you, it refines you. Like Max, who turned 7 years of street survival into a beacon of hope for others, your struggles can become the light that guides someone else home. Every night that you lie awake, feeling alone and forgotten, know that somewhere someone is searching for you. Just as Sophia baked birthday cakes for 7 empty celebrations, never losing faith that her son would return, there are hearts that hold space for your return, your recovery, your renaissance. The cruelest twists of fate, like Davenport's loss of his son driving him to torment others, remind us that unhealed wounds bleed onto those who didn't cut us. But even in our brokenness, we have a choice. We can let our pain transform us into monsters, or we can let it teach us compassion. Think of Walter silently documenting injustice, showing us that sometimes the most powerful act of kindness is simply bearing witness to another's suffering. Think of the street community, sharing their last morsels of food, proving that true wealth lies not in what we have, but in what we give. Remember Jenny, asking through tears why some get their miracles while others wait. Life isn't fair in its distribution of second chances, but we can be fair in how we use our blessings to lift others. Your miracle might not look like Max's dramatic reunion, but it lives in every moment you choose to keep going, to stay human, to help another soul survive. When you feel worthless, remember that Max's mother kept his room untouched for 7 years, because love doesn't expire, hope doesn't fade, and your worth isn't diminished by the days you spend lost. You are someone's answered prayer walking around in the world, even if you haven't found each other yet. The hardest truth is that sometimes those who hurt us are carrying their own unbearable pain, like Davenport's grief twisting him into everything he feared. But the most beautiful truth is that healing is possible, redemption is real, and it's never too late to find your way back to the light. Your struggles, your tears, your midnight fears, they're not just your burden to bear. They're your testimony, your teaching tools, your treasure to share with others who walk through similar valleys. Like Max transforming his torment into triumph, your pain can become purpose. So tonight, if you're feeling lost, forgotten, or broken beyond repair, remember this: somewhere someone is keeping your place at the table. Someone is marking your height on their heart's doorframe. Someone is baking your metaphorical birthday cake, believing in your return to wholeness. You are not the sum of what has happened to you. You are the strength it took to survive it, the wisdom it taught you, and the compassion it grew in your heart. In the end, it's not about waiting for our own miracle, it's about becoming someone else's miracle. Because in this vast world of suffering and joy, of cruelty and kindness, of loss and finding, we are all just walking each other home. Remember, every saint has a past, every sinner has a future, and every lost child deserves to find their way back to love. Your story isn't over. The chapter you're in is not the end. Keep living, keep loving, keep hoping your miracle is still unfolding. Like Max discovering his father in that moment of deepest humiliation, your darkest hour might be just one breath away from your greatest revelation. Hold on. Keep going. Your journey matters, your pain matters, your survival matters, and somewhere someone is waiting to welcome you home. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button and become part of our storytelling family. Share this message of hope with your loved ones. It might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Drop a like, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's create a community of healing and understanding together.